SEP FanFic Readings presents Thanks to the Photographs by Unstable Hufflepuff. Chapter 16. Spice Up Your Life. Pansy Knot's 25th birthday bash did, in fact, have house elves pattering around with trays of hors d'oeuvres and flutes of expensive champagne. It also featured a dance floor, beaming purple lights, and several large speakers that played every song by the Spice Girls to date. The majority of her guests were utterly nonplussed by the music selection, though Tracy Davis shrieked with delight when Two Became One came on. She and her boyfriend, another half-blood named Carter, were the only ones that didn't appear to be at all bothered by Hermione's presence. Pansy's other friends gave her a wide berth. Millicent Bulstrode, who Hermione had been especially wary of since accidentally polyjuicing herself into her cat, kept shooting her contemptuous looks. Daphne Greengrass, second only to Fleur in terms of the most beautiful witches Hermione had ever met, merely looked at her in confusion. That is, when she wasn't vying for Zabini's attention. Pansy's cousin, Priscilla Parkinson, a recent Hogwarts graduate, would leer openly at Hermione 1 minute, and then shudder in disgust the next. Hermione felt out of place, despite Knot Manor having turned into a place of comfort for her, and stuck to Draco's side for the most part. Well, until she reached her 5th drink. By then, she was dancing with Pansy and Tracy, belting out the lyrics to Spice Up Your Life, and making nearly every pureblood girl in attendance wildly uncomfortable. Though, when Zabini joined in, Daphne got a determined look on her face, downed her champagne, and marched over to join them. By 11 o'clock, everyone was suitably drunk, and Millicent was the only one still sneering at Hermione. By midnight, Tracy was attempting to explain the concept of yoga to an uncomprehending Knot. Carter was passed out on a violet chaise lounge, and Zabini and Daphne had gone missing. Hermione, meanwhile, was teaching Pansy how to do a cartwheel, though it was a trying task when Draco kept stopping them every few attempts to yank the skirt of her dress back down. At around 1 in the morning, Zabini and Daphne had returned, and they had all moved into the sitting room, leaving an unconscious Carter behind to be tended to by a house elf. Hermione had charmed the Wizarding Wireless to play Candy Shop by 50 cents for Zabini, which she seemed to be thoroughly enjoying, despite the distaste written all over Daphne's face as she perched herself on his knee. Priscilla, too, found the song incredibly crude and complained loudly. Knot merely laughed, and Tracy was too out of it, lying in a starfish position on the zebra print rug, to understand the meaning of the words. "So," Millicent said abruptly, glaring over at Hermione, who was sprawled out on one of the sofas with Draco, and gesturing jerkily at them. "How the fuck did this happen?" "How the fuck did what happen?" asked Hermione innocently. She glanced up at Draco, blinking dumbly. "Do you know what she's on about?" "No, Granger," he said, feigning bewilderment. "I haven't a clue." Millicent's nostrils flared. "Cut the bullshit," she hissed. "Is it his money you're after, Granger, or is it simply because you're a slag?" Daphne and Tracy gasped. Priscilla snickered, Zabini huffed in exasperation, and Pansy sat up from her spot on the sofa next to Knot, glaring at her. "Watch your fucking mouth, Bulstrode," said Draco furiously. "I told you there'd be none of that here, Millie," said Pansy sternly, pointing a finger at her in warning. "Granger's our friend now, so you had better get used to it." Millicent just gaped at her, going red in the face. "She's a fucking mud—" "Get out of my house," said Knot quietly. She stared at him, not moving an inch. He shifted out of Pansy's grasp and got to his feet, only slightly unsteady. Sneering down at Millicent, he said darkly, "Did you not hear me? I said, get the fuck out of my house." You can't be serious." "Get out of my house, Millicent." Millicent jumped, her eyes wide with shock, and looked to Pansy for support, but the birthday girl did not contradict her husband. Slowly standing, Millicent glanced toward Daphne, who only shrugged and gestured to Zabini, signaling that she wasn't going anywhere. With shaky legs, Millicent finally left, and there was only silence. Apart from the 50 cent song that was stuck on a loop, that is, but no one paid it any mind. Flustered, Knot dropped back down next to Pansy, who rubbed his back for support. Hermione cleared her throat awkwardly. "Thank you, Knot." "It's Theo," he said softly, without looking at her. "Please, just Theo." "All right, then, Theo." "Well," said Zabini loudly, "if we're all on a first-name basis now, you've got to start calling me Blaze." Hermione chuckled. And yet everyone still calls me Granger. Ah, love, you'll always be Granger to us. There was some light laughter, and Hermione changed the song with a wave of her wand, before asking, rather suddenly and without much thought, "Is Millicent's cat still alive?" Surprisingly, Tracy snorted. "You mean Precious? Yes, that beast is still kicking, though even in death that cat will not soon be forgotten. We've all got the scars to prove it." Pansy and Daphne both smiled ruefully. "How come you know Bulstrode has a cat?" asked Draco curiously, and Hermione gave a nervous laugh, her face heating up almost instantly. "Oh no, what did you do?" "Well, you see, I had a bit of an accident in second year," she said reluctantly, and he gestured, rather impatiently, for her to go on. "And it may or may not have resulted in spending a month in the hospital wing, polyjuiced as a cat." A shocked silence, followed by howling laughter, and she covered her face with her hands in embarrassment. "Polyjuice is for human transfiguration only, Granger. You should know this," Theo exclaimed. "Brightest witch of her age, my arse." "You brewed polyjuice potion in second year," said Pansy incredulously. "How the fuck did you get away with that? No, don't tell me. Potter was involved, wasn't he?" "God, Granger, that shit's illegal," said Tracy. "What else did you get up to when no one was looking?" "Why exactly did you attempt to turn yourself into Millie?" asked Daphne, with narrowed eyes. "Assuming that was your intention, I mean." "It was," murmured Hermione miserably. Draco gently lowered her hand so he could grin down at her, thoroughly amused. "We were sort of, Harry, Ron and I, that is, trying to get into the Slytherin common room." "What?" said several voices at once. "We thought Draco was the heir of Slytherin," she said defensively, then hastily shot Draco an apologetic look. "Harry and Ron turned themselves into Crabbe and Goyle, and snuck into your common room to see if they could get him to admit it. Obviously, we were mistaken, but we did get some useful information out of it." Draco's mouth had fallen open, and he had to give himself a little shake before finding the strength to speak again. "I'm sorry, when did this happen?" "Over the Christmas break. I'd spent a month brewing the potion in Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, and when we found out you were staying at school," she said sheepishly, "we decided it was the perfect opportunity." His eyes glazed over slightly, and he seemed to be thinking back, trying to recall which conversation he'd had with his two cronies at that time, wherein it was actually two of his enemies. "Where were Crabbe and Goyle at this time?" asked Blaise. Hermione tried not to grin too broadly. "In a broom cupboard, knocked out with a sleeping draught." "Yours or mine?" Draco asked near sunrise as he and Hermione stumbled up the marble staircase in the entrance hall, having only recently sobered enough to apparate back from Knott Manor. They didn't feel like taking the night bus again, certain that their stomachs wouldn't be able to handle it. "Unless you feel like carrying me up an extra flight of stairs," she said sluggishly, her eyes only half open. "Mine." "You're not that heavy," was Draco's conclusion, though he nearly dropped her on a moving staircase on their way up to the 5th floor. They staggered across the darkened living area and into his bedroom, where they shimmied out of most of their clothes and crawled, their limbs heavy from exhaustion, under the duvet. Hermione lay on her stomach, her arms folded under a pillow, one leg bent over Draco's thigh, and the other stretched out near the foot of the bed. She was already drifting off when he spoke, his voice a mere whisper. "I actually didn't wish you dead, you know." She opened her eyes wearily. "Huh?" "I think I figured it out," he explained, somewhat nervously. "It was after dinner on Christmas. I thought Crabbe and Goyle were acting a little strange, and they slipped out rather suddenly, which I now realize was because Potter and Weasley's hour was up and they were turning back into themselves." Hermione yawned, too tired for speech, simply nodded in confirmation. "I'm guessing they told you everything I said." She nodded again. "I lied, Hermione," said Draco regretfully, his gray eyes searching hers for what she did not know. "I may not have liked you very much at the time, but I did not wish you dead. I just thought that's what they'd want to hear. I thought that was what I was supposed to say." Hermione reached out a hand and gently placed it on the side of his face, giving him a sleepy smile. "It's okay, Draco," she whispered, stroking his cheek with her thumb. "It's in the past. It doesn't matter to me anymore." "Hermione." She shut him up by pressing a soft kiss to his lips, then pulled back, still smiling. "I forgave you, Draco," she told him, "and I stand by that decision. No matter what, I will stand by that decision." They held each other in their arms as they drifted off into a peaceful sleep. They didn't talk about that either. The temperature dropped as the following weeks flew by quickly, each of them spent similarly. Hermione and Draco shared a bed at night more often than not, and though they never admitted it to Neville or Veronica, it was fairly obvious. Their students grew into the habit of giggling and whispering behind their hands whenever they saw the pair together. Young girls blushed and let out dreamy sighs, and despite their dislike for other people being privy to their love life, Hermione was glad for it. It was a sign that she and Draco had, at long last, earned the respect of their students. So what if she still had to deal with the gossip? It was true anyway. She let them talk, for the most part, but refused to share anything. Friday nights at Knott Manor became a regular occurrence. Sometimes they were joined by Tracy Davis and her boyfriend Carter, and once Daphne Greengrass came and clung to Blaze for the entire night. But it was normally just the 5 of them. Hermione continued to introduce them all to Muggle music, and Pansy decided, and whatever Pansy decided was law, Hermione had learned, that they would go out into a Muggle club on New Year's Eve to put their newfound knowledge to the test. Hermione spent most of Sunday afternoons at the Potter home, assuming the Floo was closed and there was no danger of any Weasley beside George showing up. Teddy was often there, and she hoped one day she would get to introduce him to Draco for real. Assuming Andromeda would allow it. He needed more family members, Hermione thought, that didn't hold his new life against him, that didn't judge him for not being the perfect Malfoy heir. The first snowfall of the year was on a Saturday in late November, and she, Draco, Veronica, and Neville met Hannah Abbott and Luna in the Hogshead for drinks to celebrate Hannah getting the matron job at Hogwarts. She would start in September, and Madame Pomfrey would spend the next year supervising her before retiring in June. It was a Hogsmeade trip day, but Professors Sinistra and Vector were supervising. Minerva was still none too pleased with Hermione and Draco for their behavior on the last Hogsmeade trip. Having learnt from past mistakes, Hermione cast Muffliato over their table the minute they sat down. It was better to be safe than sorry. "We're thinking of getting a place here in Hogsmeade," Neville said happily, one arm wrapped around Hannah's shoulders. "A proper home, rather than just staying in my living quarters in the Viaduct Tower." "It's a little too cramped, and the matron's quarters aren't much better," said Hannah, smiling shyly. Her cheeks and nose were still pink from the cold. "Besides, we'd want a garden of our own." "Oh, that'd be lovely," said Luna, who had been silent up until this point, staring at a severely uncomfortable Draco. "Be sure to plant some Gertie root. They're excellent for warding off gulping blimpies." "Can you smoke that?" asked Veronica. Luna wore a thoughtful expression, taking a sip of her gilly water, and said, "Surely you can, but I've never tried before. I'm not sure what the effects would be." Hermione chose not to say anything and took a sip of her elderberry wine. It wasn't very good, and she missed the wine in Venice. They had slightly better in the Three Broomsticks, but she wanted to avoid the crowds, and Draco was banned from the pub anyway. "How will you manage living in Hogsmeade when you become the senior matron?" Draco asked Hannah, frowning slightly. "You'll have to be on call throughout the night, won't you?" "Yes, that's an issue we've been discussing quite a lot lately," she said, nodding. She took Neville's hand in her own, smiling up at him, her blush now from something rather than the cold. "But it's worth figuring out a solution for. We want a home together, no matter what we have to do to make it happen." Neville beamed, puffing out his chest with pride. "Well then," said Draco, smirking just a little, "I guess my next question is, when are you going to put a ring on her finger, Longbottom?" At that, Neville went bright red. You see, but I can't," he sighed, rubbing the side of his face. "I was planning on, it's—" "Relax, my love," said Hannah, giggling. She placed a comforting hand on the nape of his neck. "I would love to marry you, you know that, but there's no rush." He looked at her gratefully. Luna, smiling, leaned over to whisper in Hermione's ear from the seat next to her. "The ring is in his pocket." Hermione gasped and immediately slapped Draco's thigh. "Ow! What the hell was that for?" "You nearly ruined it," she whispered fiercely. "Ruined what?" he whispered back, gaping at her. "I can't tell you. I'll ruin it." He pinched her thigh. "Hey! Tell me." "No!" He poked her in the ribs, but it only tickled, and she giggled. Smirking, he did it again, and again, until she was shaking with laughter and poking him back. He slapped her hands away, snickering. God, you're such a child. You started it. Did not. Did too. Oh, wow. At the sound of her soft sigh, both Hermione and Draco turned to look at Luna. She was watching them with wide eyes. I suppose I owe you an apology, Draco. What? Blinking, Draco shook his head, as though trying to get water out of his ears. There isn't anything you have to apologize to me for, Lovegood. No, there is, said Luna sadly, propping her chin up on her hand. The rest of the table had gone silent, frowning at her in confusion. You see, you've always reminded me of your father. Draco inhaled sharply, but nodded all the same. Hermione grasped his hand under the table. Your faces were so similar before. I didn't see anything but him when I looked at you. Luna went on, her eyes becoming glassy with tears. I still dream about his face from time to time. I see him locking me in the cellar, telling me I'm never going to see my father again, that it was his fault I was there. Everything about him was so cold. I used to think you were the same, but you're not like that anymore. She gave Draco a watery smile, and a single tear slid down her nose. You're not cold, Draco, and I'm not sure if you ever truly were. I'm sorry for not seeing that until this moment. That wasn't fair to you. I hope you can find it in you to forgive me. Draco appeared to be speechless. He stared at her with his mouth hanging partly open, his eyes full of some unreadable emotion, and it took Hermione giving his hand an encouraging squeeze before he cleared his throat and finally finding his voice. Thank you, Lovegood, he said quietly. I'm very sorry that my father did that to you. That, he paused, taking a deep breath, that I didn't do anything to help you. I hope that, in time, you can forgive me too. Of course, Draco, said Luna kindly. I believe all of us here have forgiven you now. She then turned to Hermione, smiling and not bothering to wipe the tears from her face. I know Hermione has. Neville did not return with them to the castle that evening. He and Hannah traveled back to the Leaky Cauldron, above which she owned a small flat. He was a pile of nerves at that point, and Hermione wished him good luck when she hugged him farewell, though she was certain he wouldn't need it. Luna and Veronica disappeared shortly after they arrived back to Hogwarts, their heads bent towards each other, whispering fervently as they made their way down to the dungeons, the odd giggle echoing throughout the corridor. Draco was apprehended by Professor Sinistra, who had the beginnings of a cold from being outside all afternoon, while he and Hermione were climbing up the marble staircase. He had to call Creature for a pepper-up potion in order to sober up, as she'd roped him into supervising detention that night, for 3 fifth-years that had set fireworks from Weasley's Wizard Wheezes off from the astronomy tower. Therefore, Hermione was left to continue up to her quarters on her own. She thought she might spend the rest of her night with a pot of tea and a book, or perhaps make some adjustments to her lesson plans for the new year. It could still use some overlooking. That much she was sure of. She just sat down on the sofa with her first cup of tea, courtesy of Creature, after taking a long bath and dressing in her pajamas, when an owl came to her window and began pecking at the glass, urging her to be let in. He did not stay for long after she let him in, merely dropped a small scroll on her coffee table, stole a sip of her tea, and then flew back off into the night. Sitting back down on her sofa, Hermione reached for the scroll and unraveled it, instantly recognizing the untidy penmanship. Hermione, you'll find out soon enough, but I wanted you to hear it from me. I'm at St. Mungo's at the moment. Lavender went into labor this morning. The whole family is here, welcoming the arrival of Poppy Weasley. Ginny and I are godparents again. Love, Harry.